So I'm going to talk today about learning design at scale, and I know you've been studying learning design as part of the course. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we go about undertaking learning design at the Open University. And in terms of the scale, we're typically looking to design up to 100 new modules per calendar year, and anything in terms of numbers of students, that can be anything from 30, 40 students up to several thousand students. So that's the kind of scale that we're talking about operating at. But we also run learning design activity outside of the university as well. So when we know that it works not just in terms of how we go about things at the Open University, but also elsewhere as well. So just a little bit about the Open University context. You may know some of this already. So the Open University is a distance learning provider. In terms of the experience for students, on a given module, they like to have no or possibly limited face-to-face in-person teaching. We do some residentials, and we do some face-to-face day schools, but by and large, students will be studying at a distance. The bulk of study is either online using our VLE or offline using print or ebooks. We deliver modules at scale, as I mentioned before, so we can regularly have cohorts of 500 students plus studying a module. Students are supported by tutors, and we deliver all of our modules through our own OU VLE, which is based around Moodle. We work in a team design culture, so I'm going to talk about how we go about things, and it's very much from the perspective of my learning design team, but we're very much working in partnership with colleagues around the university. And in terms of the modules that we're producing, historically they've had quite a long shelf life, 8 to 10 years, but with minimal updates during that time. Increasingly now we're starting to challenge that and to start to look to make updates much more regularly and on an annual basis as well. So a little bit about where the learning design team sits. So we're part of a unit called Learner and Discovery Services, and within that there's a subunit called Design Development and Production, and the learning design team is just one team in there. And I wanted to share this just to really give you a sense of the scale at which we operate. So there are 272 staff in DDP, of which just under 20 are learning designers, but there's a lot of editors, rich media team who produce video and audio, software and graphics. There's a learning innovation team and a delivery team. So you can see it takes quite a lot of different people involved in the production side of things in order to help get modules out of the door. And this, of course, is sitting alongside each of the different faculties in the Open University as well. And in terms of what gets produced each year, so it's over 100 new modules, 350 plus maintenance modules, and you can see the numbers there in terms of the scale that we're operating at. So in terms of what is learning design, how do we see it? So we see it as a structured approach to developing and evaluating curriculum, but importantly, it's about putting the student at the heart of the design process and about designing for student engagement. So when I'm talking about it through these slides, you'll hopefully get a sense of how we go about doing that. And we make comparisons in terms of learning design when we're trying to simplify it for people and explain what we mean by it. So sometimes we talk about it in terms of a recipe, but what I'm going to talk about it today as it is comparing a little bit to like akin to building a house. So when building a house, you're going to start from the location that you've got for that house. You're going to start to think about what that means in terms of the options available, or the size of the house, the number of people that are going to be able to live in it. Then you might think about the materials for it, and then you're going to gradually go through a careful project managed process to designing and building that house. And we try to go through the learning design process in a similar careful manner, starting from that initial high level and then gradually building up the detail and the complexity as we go through the process. So I'm going to talk about essentially a number of building blocks to how we go about learning design at the Open University. So a little bit about the origins of learning design at the Open University. So in terms of how we go about it at the moment, it started from a a OU Learning Design Initiative and JISC project that ran from 2009 to 2012. So that was a project that the Open University was part of, but was part of and led on along with a number of other partners. And from that process came at the core of a lot of the building blocks that I'm going to be talking about today. It then became mandatory for all new modules and new curriculum going through production from 2014. And then most recently, what we've done in the last few years is been able to integrate student voice and evaluation into that design process. And I want to talk about the high level about some of those considerations about design. So fundamentally, when we're starting out on designing, we know that we're going to have students who are going to be ready to learn and wanting to learn joining us. And we know that they're going to go through a student journey, and that's going to be their study time with us. And what we're looking for is for students to come out the other end as successful graduates. So how are we going to achieve that? Well, at a high level, what we need is students to be able to meet the learning outcomes. So we need them to be able to demonstrate that they've learned throughout their study. And we need to do that by scaffolding opportunities for them to demonstrate their learning, and by building activities which enable them to develop their skills as they progress through that student journey. And we can't do any of that unless we understand who our students are and where they're coming from. So that's why we want to start from understanding who our students are and being able to get build that picture of who our students are, and then build from there to build that student journey and to enable them to ultimately to be able to be successful. So how do we go about it? So let's start with building block one, and this is our approach to learning design workshops. And as you can see on here, our first question here is, who are the students? But we're also asking questions there about what outcomes do they need to achieve, what do they want their experience to be, and what are they going to do in order to learn? So here we're starting to flesh out that idea of who the students are that are going to be studying this module, and then starting to outline what the module is going to look like, what the experience is going to look like for students, and the sequencing of activities that's going to enable them to do that. And when working in a face-to-face mode, we've been doing that through these creative workshop techniques. So on the left-hand side there, you can see an example of a student profile. So this is how we would start to understand who our students are. So we would, that student profile is a template which has a number of core components which enables us to build up a picture of who our students are going to be. We'd also, if we're designing a module that's a rewrite, we would be typically working with a good understanding of our students from that previous module, which would give us a great set of data to be able to work with. So we'd have a really good understanding of who our students are going to be in that scenario. On the right-hand side there, you can see a long blue sticky wall. And this is how we would run face-to-face workshops. So along the top of that wall, on that blue wall, are the weeks of study. And then what's happening in that workshop that you can see there is that we're starting to build up that picture of where the key assessment points are. We're starting to flesh out where the key activities are going to be and what kind of skills are being developed as we're going through those weeks as well. So that's how we would do things in a face-to-face mode. But obviously over the past couple of years, we've not been in that face-to-face mode. We've been having to work remotely. So we've had to adapt as we've gone along. So in that face-to-face mode, this is what a typical workshop structure might look like. So once we've gone past the welcome, we would start by looking at the student profiles. As I say, understanding our students coming first. Then we'd look to start mapping the module structure, then map the activities and skills development, and then wrap up the workshop. So that comes back to those key questions from that earlier slide of where's the student starting from, where do we need to get them to, and how are we going to help them to get there. And what we always find worked really well in face-to-face environment was making sure that we had a good lunch to inspire people for the afternoon ahead as well. So that was our face-to-face mode of working, but obviously we're in a scenario now where we're delivering many of our workshops remotely, and that means we're having to adapt the approach we take to the workshops, but also the way that we go about capturing the outputs. So we're doing that increasingly through using these collaborative online tools. So there's a couple of examples here that we've worked with for OU modules. And you can see it's got the same kind of color coding that we might use with face-to-face in terms of post-its. And it's aiming to do a similar sort of thing. So using the example on the left, you can see at the top, you've got learning outcomes mapped. Then in the green, you've got the key activities. And then further down, you've got assessment and skills being developed. So we're gradually building that up over the course of a workshop, but also after workshops as well, to map out the student journey. So we've used a number of collaborative tools for that over time. We're still using Cardsmith, but increasingly now we're also using Miro as a tool for enabling us to have those rich online collaborative workshops. And then the second building block is the OU Learning Design Activity Types framework. And this is what helps us to develop an active learning approach to study for students. So you can see here, we've got a number of different categories. We've got assimilative, communicative, finding and handling information, productive, and practice. So when we're going through the process of designing and when we're going through the workshop activities, what we encourage teams to be thinking of is thinking about everything that the student does as an activity, and to then be designing a sequence of activities for the students. And all of those activities ideally will be aligning to the assessments that the students have to carry out during their study with us as well. So you can see on here that each of these activity types has then got a number of different verbs next to it, which gives you an idea as to the kinds of activities that students are going to be doing in each of those. And what we're aiming to encourage is as much use of the communicative, the finding and handling information, the productive and practice as possible, so that you're getting a good, rich, active learning approach to modules and to the study for the students. We know in particular that if we embed more communicative activities, we know that that has a positive impact on student retention, for instance. So we're looking to try to develop and support teams in thinking about how they can use some of those active learning approaches. And one of the tools we've got to enable that it is the activity planner. So this basically maps things out in terms of each week, has the learning outcomes for that week, and then you start to map out what kinds of activities students might be doing during that week. And we'd be starting that discussion in the workshop, getting a good collaborative conversation going about what kinds of activities we could do. That enables us then to be thinking about, well, have we got examples from past modules that we can reference to? We've got good examples from elsewhere that we can either reuse or that we can learn from that can help us in terms of planning this particular module. And some of the key aspects here for us, firstly, that it keeps the learning outcomes in focus. So as I mentioned, what we're looking for is that all of the activities are ideally aligning to both the assessment and to the learning outcomes. So if you've got those learning outcomes referenced on the planner that you're working with, then that helps you to make sure that that mapping is happening. And then what we're also looking for is we're looking for that balance of activities and making sure that as we're mapping those activities out, that the students have got the requisite skills to be able to do this. So we want, I mentioned scaffolding earlier, we want to encourage an activity design that's supporting students by taking them along carefully along the route of their study, so that then we're not expecting them to do activities that are beyond the level that they've got to in their study to that point. We're expecting them to kind of gradually build up as we go through the module. So that leads me on to the next building block, and that is about how we have a structured approach to supporting design. So once we've done that first workshop with the teams, we're looking to provide targeted support to teams at a point where they need it. And we have the diagram on the right-hand side here shows the learning design core offer that we work with. So at the top, you've got the learning design workshop, but there's a number of different aspects here to that core offer that we use to support teams at the point at which they need it. So the iceberg picture here represents the iceberg principles, which I'll mention in a moment. And those are a set of design for retention principles that we know will support students and help them to be successful. Workload is about understanding how many hours per week the students have got to study, and trying to make sure that we're building in an appropriate amount of module guided activities for students for each week, and we're not overloading them during each week. But importantly, as well as not overloading them, but that we're also making sure that it's consistent from week to week, so we're not getting peaks and troughs in the workload, and also that we're building in that balance of activities as that we go along as well. We're looking to make sure that we focus on the student journey. So the time scale that we can be working on in the design process can be quite long. So if we start with a learning design workshop in March, it can be that we get to September and we're still working on production. So we use the student journey quite often as a tool for refreshing and revisiting how the student journey is going to look for a particular block of a module, for instance, and to be able to then revisit and just make sure that we've got that picture in mind of where students are starting that block and where they're ending that block and what they're going to be doing during that time. We support teams in thinking about online tools. So making sure that we make an appropriate use of the VLE and bringing in tools for the right reasons according to the pedagogy of the module. And then lastly, in terms of evaluation, so I'm going to come on to evaluation a bit later, but we try to build in our approach to evaluation right from the start. So we've got ways that we can bring in student voice early on, and we can bring in that student voice during the design process in such a way that helps us then to be making sure that what goes live to students has had some student voice input before it goes live, for instance. Okay. So I mentioned iceberg. So the iceberg principles that we work with are a set of design for retention principles, and they're called iceberg because they, as you can see on here, if you look at the initials for each of the words of that we're referencing as a principle here, it spells out iceberg. So the first point on here is about being integrated. So this is about making sure that the journey through the learning materials is clear and well signposted. Second point is about being collaborative. So making sure there's an active community of learners and that they're engaging in deeper learning. The third point is about being engaging, making sure that students are at the center and have active learning strategies. The next point is about balanced, so making sure that the workload is well paced, as I've mentioned, and that skills are integrated into the curriculum. Then economical, where learning activities are clearly aligned to the intended learning outcomes and assessments. That it's reflective, so that students have time and space to reflect. And lastly, that it's gradual, so that complex tasks are introduced gradually and learning is scaffolded. So I've included the reference to this at the back of the presentation. So if you want to know more about the iceberg principles, you can follow that link and be able to learn more about them. So the next thing I want to mention is about student workload, but this also maps to thinking about the balance of activities. So as we go through the design and production process, we'll start to get a sense of all of the components that are going to be making up the module. So we can then, once we've got that more detailed level, we can start actually mapping out how many words that's going to be, for instance, for students to read. We can start mapping out how much media is going to be within a given week, and we can then also understand what kind of activities types we're using as well. And that means that you can then plug that all into to review whether or not what you're producing at a detail level mirrors what you identified early on. So if you remember that activity planner that I was referring to earlier, in an early workshop, we'll be looking at that activity planner and mapping out our aspirations for the module. By the time you get to here, this is actually what you're producing. So you can then have a look at the outputs from this and look at it and say, okay, well, this is what we're actually producing. Refer back to those aspirations you had in your workshop and say, well, okay, how are these comparing? And if they're different, why are they different? Are we happy about the reasons why they're different, or actually are there things we need to look at here? So this gives us a detail level view as we go along and gives us a mechanism for that design review activity as we go through production, which can be really valuable for teams to be able to step back at points during their design process and go, okay, we're on track, that's all good, we're happy with how we're going, or actually we've got an issue in, say, week 6 and we need to look at that and we need to spend a bit of time assessing it. So it's a useful tool to be able to make adjustments as we're going along through that process. And the final building block I want to reference is about using student voice and learning analytics. So in particular, in terms of learning analytics here and about student voice as things are live, we need to recognize that our designs might not be perfect up front, and we need to be prepared to act on feedback and act on data. So we can do that before things go live. We can prototype activities, and we can use those prototypes to put them in front of students, get some responses from students, refine them before they go live. But then also, once we have got the modules live, we've got that option to be able to use either a mechanism for gathering student feedback or the learning analytics that are coming out of the system to be able to look at it and say, okay, actually we need to make some adjustments here. And the table I've got on the screen here is just aimed really at showing the kinds of interventions that we might be able to make. So we could, for instance, make adjustments before the start of a module. And those might be slightly bigger in terms of nature because we've got a bit of time before the next presentation of a module starts. Or we might be able to make things changes during the module, in action interventions. And if we're making those, they're going to be smaller typically because the module is up and running. We might not have the time to be making big changes, but we can still do some things. So you can see some of the examples at the top right there for in action interventions include audio feedback on assignments or a boot camp before an exam. Whereas if you're thinking about making changes before the module starts, those could be bigger ones. You could be redesigning the learning materials, you could be redesigning the assignments. So it's about thinking about where you are and what options are open to you at each point in time in terms of how you might make adjustments. So in terms of how we draw in that student voice, so we run something called the Curriculum Design Student Panel, and that enables us to not just work more directly with students, but it enables us to get student testing done, essentially. So we can, whilst going through that design process, we can look at a particular activity, we can put that to the student panel, particularly to members of the student panel who are who've got the same background as the module that we're going to be producing, and we can ask them to test it for us, and we can use the responses to that testing to inform what ultimately goes live. So we can make improvements during the design process, which then make sure that what goes live to students ultimately is going to have had that student voice, but is also hopefully going to have ironed out any key issues that might have gone live otherwise if we hadn't got that student voice. So it's about empowering students, as it mentions on there, and we refresh that twice a year. And as I mentioned, there's over 3,000 students registered for the panel, and we know that they all of the students engaged with the panel find it really useful and really interesting process to be part of and enjoy giving their feedback to us. And one of the ways that we've used the panel recently is we've put a number of recommendations together about how the OU should go about structuring modules. So we've put some recommendations through about how we use our online study planner, how we support students with their workload, with activity design, forums and assessment. We've put those recommendations then out to the panel, and we've been able to get back from our students a top 5 in terms of what they thought were the key things for them from those recommendations. So you can see on here, providing a clear and consistent structure, using clear, straightforward language, building in preparation time for TMAs, clearly signposting, and providing opportunities to test understanding using practice quizzes are key things for the students. And then we've also had a bottom 5 responses in terms of the things that they don't feel are quite as important, which has been interesting because I think actually that reflects where some students, perhaps for some students it's actually been very important, but then for other students it's perhaps not been quite as important. So this doesn't mean that these aren't things that we would we're going to be doing, but they're things that actually, it indicates a bit of a range in terms of the student responses that we're getting back on this. And in particular, you can see there the student response in terms of feeling part of the community and having well-structured activities to discuss work with other students. Well, we know from some of our findings from our own scholarship, we know that students actually have quite strong reactions to working with other students. Some really like it, some don't like it quite as much. And so that actually is indicating that kind of strength of feeling around those types of activities, for instance. So it can be really valuable to have that kind of resource to draw on and to be able to get that student voice input into activities, but also into longer term views and perspectives in terms of the direction of travel that you're looking to take as a university. And then in terms of how we work with learning analytics, so we run a process called Analytics for Action. And that process basically is one where when a module is in its first presentation, we will provide 3 data support meetings for the module team to look at how the module is performing, look at the top level data, and to be able then to use that data to look at any key issues and suggest any actions that we might need to take to address any issues that we identify from those meetings. So basically what we're looking to do here is to use the data that's coming out of the system to look at what's going on in a live module and to be able to then make an evidence-based change in presentation. And as I mentioned from that earlier slide, there are options there in terms of whether we make those changes during the presentation itself, or whether we wait until the start of the next module. So looking at some examples of how we've gone about doing that and some of the things that we found. So this example, we saw low engagement with a particular activity at an assessment point, which was concerning the module team. So we put some work in alongside the module team to address that. And what we saw subsequently in the next cohort of students was a big improvement. And we saw that big improvement not just in terms of the engagement with this particular activity, but also with the assessment outcomes. So what we had the first time round was the red line that you can hopefully see on here, which around between weeks 13 and 15, there was hardly any engagement with this activity. And that was at the assessment point there was at week 13. When we made the change, what we saw then in using this yellow line was a big spike in student activity in between weeks 13 and 15, and that coincided with the assessment point being in week 15. So we saw a big change in student behaviors as a result of making changes to the design, both of the activity and of the assessment, and from being able to use the data coming back to us from our dashboard to show us how that engagement was happening in the first presentation. Okay, and then another example here is quite an interesting one in that what we saw changes over time from one presentation to another. So what we're looking at here is engagement with the assessment guide for a given module, and what we identified in the first presentation was that we weren't seeing it, or the module team felt they weren't seeing enough engagement with the assessment guide that had been put together. So for the second presentation, they made some adjustments and started to see much better engagement. But then in the following presentation, there was a drop-off in those the engagement, and it was only in the last assessment point that we saw the pickup happen again. And that was because what had happened during the process was that for this presentation here, we had the really good engagement, and an adjustment had been made, but then it hadn't been stored and remembered for the next time around, and so the adjustment didn't happen for that time around. So it's a really interesting example of how you can make a positive intervention, but also making sure that we've got the organizational memory for the following presentation to make sure that any adjustment that's happened there is happening for the following presentation as well. So I hope that makes sense, but yes, it was an interesting example for us to look at. And I mean, these might seem like quite small level examples, and they are, but actually what we feel is that through seeing all of these micro level adjustments and seeing the impact of them, it gives us a really interesting set of stories that we can then use to inform what we're doing for subsequent presentations. So what this one's saying to us is that it's key for the assessment guide to be made available to students at each assessment point during their study, if we want to make sure that students are actually going to engage with it and going to make use of it as they go along. And that might seem like a really small and obvious thing to be doing, but clearly we weren't doing it previously. So it's been really interesting to look at that and to be able to make that small continuous improvement change to the way that we approach our use of the study planner online. Okay, so when all of that comes together, ideally, what we're going to see are positive results. And this particular one is one that one of the learning designers from the teams put together from their work that they did with a second level sports module. So this shows the different stages in our process, and then what the individual learning designer did along at each point in the process, with the end result being that we know we had high completion, pass and satisfaction rates. So this started from co-facilitating a workshop with several module teams. It then led into providing detailed workload and activity mapping. It then led into sharing scholarship around induction materials and get started materials, and then working on accessibility aspects of the design, and then providing the data support in the first presentation that identifies specific issues and opportunities for interventions there to support the students when the module was up and running. So a really nice example of the different stages of our process and the different activities that are happening along the way, and the end result that can come from that when it works really well. And that's it from me. So as I mentioned, I've got a series of references there that you can hopefully refer to if you want to. And I just want to point you to the one about iceberg is this link at the bottom, learning design for student retention. But that's it from me, and I'm going to stop at that point and ask if there are any questions.